My name is Margaret Heritage, and in this webinar, I'm going to provide an overview of formative assessment. So let's begin with the question, what is formative assessment? Well, to begin answering this, I want to quote from renowned psychologist and educator Jerome Bruner. And what Jerome Bruner said many years ago is that good teaching is forever being on the cutting edge of a child's competence. And what he meant by this is that what teachers teach is intended to be matched to the current state of student learning so that students can advance from where they are now to where they can go next. This is a really important concept in formative assessment. Formative assessment's main goal is to figure out, as far as humanly possible, what is the cutting edge of a child's competence and to build on that so that the child can take next steps in learning. So to get a bit more specific about formative assessment, first, it's a type of assessment where the focus is on informing learning rather than measuring it or summing it up. Other kinds of assessment, the end of the year state test, for example, sum up a whole year's worth of learning. A summative assessment from the classroom might assess what students have learned in the course of a unit, or a benchmark assessment, what they've learned over several months. But the idea of formative assessment is that it is intended to inform teachers and learners about the status of learning as it is taking place, not at the end of a sequence of learning, but during the learning as that learning is evolving. And as I mentioned in the context of the Jerome Bruner quote, the purpose of formative assessment is to move learning forward from its current status. So wherever the student is in learning, whether it's learning math, science, social studies, English language arts, the whole point of formative assessment is to figure out where learners are and how to move them to the next stage. And one final point about formative assessment, and this is really important, formative assessment has been shown to improve learning. So when formative assessment is effectively implemented, research tells us that learning of all students can be improved. And this is why formative assessment is so important to classroom practice. So if we think about learning on the edge of a student's current competence, what we can think about here is placing student learning in their learning zone. We don't want student learning to be in the panic zone because students, when they're panicking, are not available for learning, nor do we want them to be in the comfort zone. We don't want them cruising along through school. We want to be consistently placing what we teach and what children are engaged in learning in that learning zone so that learning is consistently and constantly moving forward. And the idea of formative assessment is to figure out, as far as humanly possible, where that learning zone is for each student and what that student can do next with assistance, so that gradually they can appropriate the learning for themselves and it becomes part of the student's independent achievement. And so the notion of formative assessment then is what students can do next with assistance to keep them on track to meeting the learning goals of a lesson. And formative assessment really takes place at the lesson level, 1, 2, 3 class periods, so that students are maintained on track throughout the lesson so that they can reach the desired goals. And so here you can see there's a track, and the point about learning is that it's consistently moving forward to meet the destination of the desired end of lesson goal. And what we want to find from our formative assessment opportunities are qualitative insights along the way. So as children are evolving in their learning along that track towards the desired goals, the job of the teacher is to figure out what is the student thinking at a particular point? How is the student reasoning? What kind of skills is the student developing? And you'll see I've used the word qualitative here. The point is that we want descriptive information. We're not looking at scores. We're not looking for a score about student learning. What we're looking for is an instance of what students say, do, make, or write that helps teachers figure out where the learner is right then and there in the lesson and what needs to happen to keep learning on track to meeting the goals. One other thing that's important to note about formative assessment is that formative assessment is not just for teachers. It's for both teachers and students. Students are equal stakeholders in the process because, after all, they're the ones doing the learning. We can help them learn, but at the end of the day, learning is the property of the learner. They're the only ones that can actually do the learning. And so students need to be involved in the whole process of formative assessment. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. I want to share now, though, a quote from a teacher who'd been thinking about formative assessment for quite some time and had engaged in implementing formative assessment in his classroom. And this is his quote. He said that, "I used to think that formative assessment was something that happened at the culmination of a lesson. Now I think formative assessment is a continuous process throughout the lesson." So he's really underscoring what he's learned about formative assessment, that it's a continuous process that keeps on going throughout the lesson, as I said, to get those qualitative insights and to keep student learning on track. So let's just summarize now what formative assessment is and what it is not. So first of all, formative assessment is intentionally, and you'll see I've bolded that, intentionally, because it's planned, intentionally obtaining evidence in the course of continuous teaching and learning through observation, discussion, questioning, and review and analysis of tasks and work. So formative assessment is not a test event. It's not giving a test on a predetermined basis, for example, at the end of a quarter or the end of the year. Those tests, those assessments have different purposes. Their purpose is not to inform instruction day by day, as formative assessment is. And you'll see that there's various ways in which formative assessment information can be obtained while students are learning, through observing them, through discussing their work, through asking questions, and through a review and analysis of their work products. The second thing that formative assessment does is to gauge how student learning is progressing while the students are in the process of learning. So the idea is it's not an assessment given at the end of a sequence of learning. That kind of assessment serves another purpose. So it's not evaluating student achievement as grades would be, or a summative classroom test, or a benchmark, or an annual test. It's not about evaluating, it's about gauging where the learner is so that learning can progress. The next piece about formative assessment is that teachers use the evidence they obtain to inform their decisions about teaching and learning. So immediate or near immediate. So it might be there and then in the lesson. It might be later in the lesson that the teachers do something based on the evidence. And then they'll plan how to develop the lesson, the particular class period, into the next lesson the next day, so that what they're planning is based on evidence of what the students have learned to that point. So it's not about using test data to make decisions about medium and long-term learning. That's the purview of the other kinds of assessments that I have been talking about. A key in formative assessment is providing descriptive feedback to learners, ongoing descriptive feedback that is so critical to learning. And this is not grading. It's not about assigning grades or reporting achievement. Grades serve another purpose, reporting achievement serves another purpose. The whole idea of formative assessment is that you want to make the data, the evidence that you've obtained as a teacher, as out of date as quickly as possible. So that if you're responding to the evidence minute by minute, day by day, that learning is moving forward. And then you can evaluate how much children have learned after a given period of learning by a grade or by another form of assessment. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, formative assessment is about involving students in the assessment process through peer and self-assessment. So students are encouraged and supported to engage in self-assessment, assessing their own learning and making decisions about what they need to do next, and also supporting their peers by providing peer feedback about their learning and about their work, which, as we know from research, also helps students internalize their own learning goals more thoroughly and can provide insights into their own learning as well as that of their peers. And the final point I want to make here is that formative assessment is not about telling students the results of a test. That's a different kind of assessment where students get a score and they are assigned a level of achievement. And so to conclude this section, I want to offer another quote from a teacher who'd gone through the same process as the previous teacher, and this was her reflection. I used to think that formative assessment was giving more quizzes mid-unit. Now I think formative assessment is good dialogue, expert observation, thoughtful questioning, and flexible guidance throughout a lesson to ensure every student is on track. So you can see that this teacher has really internalized the idea of formative assessment as something that's ongoing through the lesson, where evidence is obtained from dialogue, observation, questioning, and flexible guidance is offered to students to make sure that each one of them is on track to meet the goal. So now I'd like to just spend a brief amount of time thinking about where formative assessments fit in the bigger assessment system, a comprehensive assessment system. So we know the general rule of assessment is that one size does not fit all. It is not possible to use a summative assessment to plan daily instruction, and it is not possible to use ongoing formative assessment as a way to evaluate a year's worth of learning. Look at this comprehensive assessment system here, where we have a range of different assessments to provide a range of information for those people who make decisions about student learning, from teachers through to principals, through to district administrators, through to policymakers. We can see that the smallest grain size, that is the circle closest to the student, is where classroom formative assessment takes place. And the largest grain size at the other end of the continuum is the end of the year, the annual summative assessment. And that's the largest grain size because it covers a whole year's worth of learning. And you'll see that the assessment types feed into one another. So the smallest grain size, the classroom formative assessment in-process evidence, connects to the more formal checkpoints. That may be when teachers gather student work and they start to analyze it and look at what students have learned, make decisions about what they need to do next. Or that could be when teachers are using progress monitorings to examine the effects of interventions that have been provided for students. The next grain size classroom summative assessment, where that would be assessment given at the end of a unit, maybe for grading purposes. Interim benchmark assessment that covers a longer period of learning to see how learning is developing and are students on track to meet the end of the year summative assessment. So these all provide different levels of detail for the decisions that need to be made about student learning across the system. And of course, the information we're talking about now is the smallest grain size that is closest to the student, the classroom formative in-process evidence. So I hope that helps you see where formative assessment sits in this larger assessment system. Now what I want to do is to go back to the idea of formative assessment, specifically implementing formative assessment with the idea of a feedback loop. So the process of formative assessment is basically grounded in three main questions, three guiding questions. And these questions are equally applicable to students and to teachers. So the first one is, where am I going? What am I learning? Why am I learning it? And how will I know if I've learned it? The second question is, where am I now? Where am I now in relation to what I'm supposed to be learning? Am I beginning to learn it? Am I further along in my learning? Where am I in relation to the goal that's been set for me for this lesson? And then the third question is, based on where I am now, where am I going to go to next? What's going to happen so that I keep moving forward on track to meet those learning goals? And the idea of these three questions is that they help close the gap. The idea of the gap comes from Roy Sadler, an Australian scholar, in a seminal paper he wrote in 1989. And what the gap means is the gap between where students are at the beginning of a lesson and where they are at the end of a lesson. It's not the achievement gap. We still have an achievement gap, unfortunately, where some subgroups of students aren't doing as well as other students. But that isn't applicable to formative assessment in terms of the gap. The gap is, where do I start at the beginning of the lesson? Where do I want to end up? And then formative assessment helps me as a student and me as a teacher close that gap. So if we see the next slide, we can see how it works. Here we have the learning status at the start of the lesson, wherever the student is, ready to move to the learning goal at the end of the lesson, 1, 2, 3 class periods. And formative assessment is the means to keep that learning moving forward on track to meet the lesson goal and close the gap. And of course, when one gap closes, another one opens. That is in the nature of learning. And so the next slide shows us the components of this feedback loop grounded in these three questions. Where am I going? Where am I now? And where to next? With the whole idea, as you can see at the end, closing the gap. And this is a continuous feedback loop that's operating throughout each lesson, each class period, so that student learning is consistently moving forward. So if we look at the first question, where am I going? We can see that from building blocks, those are the incremental steps from one standard to another standard. We can determine the learning goals for the lesson. What are the students going to learn? So the question there is, what are they going to learn and how will they know if they've learned it? How will I as a teacher know? And then the success criteria are those indicators of performance. How will I know and how will the students know if they've learned what I wanted them to learn? So just to think for a minute about lesson goals, the standards themselves are too big for lesson goals. The standards specify what students are going to learn at the end of a grade level. And so the learning goals are, as I said, those building blocks. What happens in between each of the standards? What are those steps along the way that support the student to get from the end of one year's standard to the end of the next? And so the learning goals are derived from that idea, that pathway, and they focus on what students will learn, not what tasks and activities they're going to do. That's secondary. And as I've mentioned, a lesson is one or more periods of learning. And the learning goals are introduced at some point in the lesson, either at the beginning or partway through after an exploratory activity that the students have had to surface some ideas. But the goal of formative assessment is that students should understand what they're learning and why they're learning it. And the second part of this is the success criteria. These are the performances of learning. So not only do they need to understand the learning goal, they need to be helped to understand what the goal means in terms of the criteria. What does it mean to actually meet the learning goal? And of course, the success criteria need to be aligned to the goal because they're the indicators of the student learning. And so we can think about what students will say, do, make, or write to indicate that they're on track to meeting the goal and have met the goal. And so the same questions as we have for teachers are the same for students. What am I learning? So students should be able to say what they're supposed to be learning and why they're learning it. And they should also be able to say how they'll know if they've learned it. So that's the red zone. Where am I going? So if we move to the next question, where am I now, in the blue zone, the whole point of this area of the feedback loop is to obtain evidence of learning. So from a teacher's perspective, the teacher is intentionally planning how he or she is going to obtain evidence of learning while the students are learning. And as we mentioned previously, the way to do this, there's not one single way, but it's done during the learning activities, through observation, through dialogue, through the learning tasks the students are involved in, and through questioning and discussion. And the good news is that if learning tasks are well designed and they're going to produce high levels of thinking and engage students in reasoning, then they're going to serve as assessment as well, an assessment task. So it's not that you have to think, oh, well, I'm doing this learning task and then I've got to assess it. If it's designed to build kids' thinking, then it's going to give the teacher some insights into how that thinking is developing. And then the next part is the where to next, taking that responsive action. So based on the evidence the teacher has, they take that responsive action, whatever it is, with the goal of keeping learning moving forward. And these deliberate acts of teaching, these deliberate responses that teachers make, can take the form of modeling, questioning, prompting, telling, explaining, and feedback. So the teachers have these deliberate acts of teaching in their repertoire that they can implement depending on the nature of the evidence. So does the evidence tell me that I need to do some modeling? Or can I ask a question or give the student a prompt that's going to push them or nudge them into the next step of this learning? Do I need to explain something? Telling, of course, should be used very judiciously, mainly as a way to keep the momentum of learning going. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the idea of feedback is so critical in formative assessment, descriptive feedback. And if we look at the work of John Hattie, we can see that the influence feedback has an effect size of 0.73. So what Hattie did was he looked in his research, he looked at various influences on learning, and these are just some of them. And you can see that feedback is one that's very powerful and significant. And Hattie says those above 0.4 are influences we need to pay attention to, whereas those below 0.4 are influences that we might want to give further consideration. And you can see that feedback is a powerful influence. So with it being that powerful, and that's one of the reasons that formative assessment works, is that we need to ensure that feedback is a part of a child's learning repertoire. So when teachers give feedback, oral in the moment or written feedback, certain characteristics need to apply. First of all, it needs to be related to the learning goals and the criteria. The whole idea of feedback is to help students take action for themselves to close the gap. So the teacher needs to highlight the discrepancy between where the learner is and the goal and make suggestions about how to get there. So the purpose of feedback is to provide hints or suggestions or cues, but not to give solutions or correct answers. If you give the student the correct answer, you prevented the student from learning for themselves. The other thing about feedback is it should focus on the learner and not on the individual. So feedback shouldn't be about praise without saying why the learning has been successful. It needs to engage student thinking, The whole point is to help students move forward, and so we want to engage students' thinking so that they can take those actions based on that flexible guidance they're given. And of course, the final thing is feedback must be used by students. If teachers are going to give opportunities for students to receive feedback from either themselves or their peers, it's really useless unless students have the opportunity to use it to improve their work. So if we look at one more quote from a teacher, a different teacher this time, this teacher posted, "I used to think that giving feedback to students at the end of a project or test was sufficient. Now I know that it is the feedback I give students during the learning, based on success criteria, is what matters. Also, I am not the only one providing feedback," indicating the role of students in providing feedback to each other, of course, based on those success criteria. So for students then, the blue zone of the feedback loop, and this is where they're involved in the process. First of all, they understand what meeting the goal entails, they understand the success criteria and what they have to do to meet the goal, what performances they have to show. And so as a result, they're able to engage in self-assessment and they can provide peer feedback. Now, there isn't time in this webinar to talk in detail about how students need to be supported to do this, but these skills need to be taught, and the good news is they can be taught, and they need to be monitored and nurtured all the way through a student's schooling. So that the ultimate goal is that students can move their own learning forward, that they're determining what they need to do next based on the feedback they receive and from their own internal self-assessment. And learner agency is a big component of formative assessment as a process, wanting students to take more and more responsibility. And so one final point I want to make after the feedback loop is really about the classroom culture. The classroom culture is critical for formative assessment and indeed for learning. And I just want to highlight a few of the culture characteristics that really need to be in place for formative assessment to take place. So the first one is that the idea of shared responsibility for learning. That it's not teachers doing all the work, students are engaged in their own learning, taking responsibility for that learning with teacher support. So shared responsibility for learning. The next one is positive interactions. Teachers are going to model positive interactions that they want their own students to engage in by the way they speak to the students and by the way they support their students to engage with each other. So the idea of positive interactions and the modeling and the respect that teachers show for students is essential. The next one is the idea of supportive collaborative relationships, that we want students to be learning with and from each other, and we want students to be willing to express their ideas, express their own thinking, no matter at what stage of development the thinking is. We cannot have students who are afraid or fearful of sharing where they are in their thinking with the teacher or with their peers. So this idea of supportive collaboration is also essential. And the idea of mutual trust is threaded through that students, there's research now to suggest that students will shut down if they don't believe that the people that they're working with, either peers or teachers, have their best interests at heart. So this idea of mutual trust. And one of the ways to build that mutual trust is through establishing clear routines and participant structures. When you want students to talk, the structures that you put in place to enable turn taking and each student having an equal opportunity to engage in the discussion and contribute to the group's thinking. So the idea of routines that are consistent and participant structures really underscores and underpins so much of what I've already talked about, the interactions, the relationships, and the mutual trust, and that shared responsibility. And then finally, the classroom being learning and learner-centered. That it's not about busy work, it's not about doing a whole load of other stuff. It's focused on the learning. That is why students come to school. And so these are just some of the characteristics for you to think about in terms of what constitutes a positive classroom culture. And I'm sure that you will have your own that you would want to add to this as well. Just something to think about, and the importance of those characteristics to students being willing to share their thinking and act on feedback without fear of any kind of sanction or ridicule. So this brings us to the end. Just to sum up then, formative assessment can improve the learning of all students. We know that from research. Formative assessment is for both teachers and students. They play an equal role in the process. 3 key questions guide the formative assessment implementation. Where am I going? Where am I now? Where to next? To close the gap between the learner's initial status and the end goal. And then finally, the classroom culture impacts the process of formative assessment and is so essential for effective formative assessment and indeed effective learning to take place. Thank you.